Hi guys, wanted to show you guys how to do the compositing portion of the multipass example. So that should be the first example that we go through and set up. And so we're going to start by importing the files. And when we're compositing, I generally recommend choosing multiple files since we typically have several sequences to bring in. So right click, multiple files, and you want to browse to where you saved those sequences. So for me, that's going to be in that last name, first name, output, and in sequence. And then we can see the three different examples we'll be going through, but I'm going to start with multipass. Okay, so I'm going to go into the multipass folder and I'm going to choose any frame from my beauty pass. Okay, so it can be the first frame, last frame, doesn't matter. What I'm looking for is to make sure that the sequence option is checked. From there, I'll hit import. Okay, should take a second. And now I'm going to go down to my next sequence, which in this case is ambient occlusion. Once again, any frame, hit import, hit import. All right, AO is done. Depth pass, import, object buffer, import. So those are the four sequences we're going to be using. And once you've brought them all in, the window will pop up again. Just make sure to hit none. Okay. And, once again, we can tell these are sequences because we can see the frame range right here. So we should be seeing 0 to 120 for all of these. Okay. So let's start by bringing in our beauty pass, our main pass, and dragging that onto the new composition button. Okay. Now, actually, one thing I'm going to do just because I can tell mine is different, but I want you guys to check yours as well, is to check what color depth we're working on or color space. So I'm set to 32 bits. I occasionally do this when I'm doing some freelance compositing stuff, but for this project and generally our projects, we can get away with 8, maybe 16. So I'm going to click where it says 32 bits, and in my color management section here, I'm going to switch the depth from 32-bit floating point to 8. Okay, so I'll go ahead and hit OK. And really, it shouldn't change the way this looks or anything. All right, but now we have that out of the way, we can get started. So our beauty pass, if we just scrub through just so we can, see what we're working with here. Camera's coming out of the saloon. All right, there we go. Logo builds up. We got a tumbleweed rolling across the screen. The logo rotates off, and that's all she wrote. So when we're putting stuff together, especially projects like our logo build-ups, we want to find a frame where everything's on screen. So typically that's towards the end of our projects, and that's the case with this one here. Okay, so this frame will work pretty good. Roughly 3 seconds, 9 frames in. I actually prefer to see the frame numbers large, and if you can see that, it says control click for alternate display style. And so it might be a different combination for a Mac, but if I control click, now I'm seeing the actual frame number I'm on. And so I like working this way because this typically lines up a bit more and a bit better with our preview range from Cinema 4D. Okay, so with our beauty pass in place and us around frame 99, okay, I'm going to take my AO pass, place it above the beauty pass. Great. And the blending mode we're looking for here is multiply. Okay. So that's what we're doing with our ambient occlusion is using the multiply blending mode here. If I toggle the visibility of this layer on or off, you can see what's happening and try to ignore the white background because that is only temporary. But if you look at the logo here, notice how it's really helping the smaller details pop out. Ambient occlusion gives us nice contact shadows. So whenever we have two objects kind of intersecting or very close together, we'll get nice contact shadows, and overall it just gives us more contrast. So, the reason we want this is a multipass so we have control over it inside of After Effects without having to re-render if we want more strength, less strength, or to get rid of it completely. So if I want less ambient occlusion, I can select my ambient occlusion layer, hit T to pull up my opacity options, and lower the opacity until I'm happy with the result. Okay. If for some reason it was grainy or noisy, or I decide I don't want it, I can always just turn off its visibility or just delete the layer entirely. Okay. If I want more, which doesn't happen all that often, we can always duplicate this layer, and that's Controller Command D. All right, so you can see how that really builds up the ambient occlusion, and obviously that's a bit too much here. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is work with our object buffer. Okay, now our object buffer, and I'm just going to double click on this to pull up the sequence, if you recall, was set up using the compositing tag on whatever object we wanted to be able to separate onto its own layer in After Effects and apply unique effects to it. Color correction, glows, whatever the case may be. And so for this, we did it with the Dodge City text. Okay, so I'm going to close this footage window and go back to my composition. And now what we want to do is place this object buffer sequence above the beauty pass and below the ambient occlusion. So in between the ambient occlusion and the beauty pass. And you'll notice all we really see right now is our object buffer pass, and that's perfectly fine. Okay. We don't want to go turning off the visibility of this layer or anything like that, because what we need to do is on our beauty pass, we want to find our track matte options. And if we're not seeing those, we may need to toggle switches and modes. Okay. And the track matte options for the beauty pass, we want to click where it says none and choose Luma Matte. Okay. And I know you guys have already talked about track mattes, but Luma Mattes use black and white values. Alpha Matte uses transparency. Okay, so we want Luma Matte. All right, notice now how the only part of the beauty pass we're seeing is the Dodge City text, or where the object buffer was white. Okay, so when we chose that, it set the track matte options of the beauty pass to Luma Matte, and it hid our object buffer 1 layer for us. Okay, so whenever you set up the track matte options on a layer, it's always going to look to the layer directly above it. You'll notice if I just click back here, regardless of which option I choose, alpha matte, alpha inverted, luma, luma inverted, it's using the object buffer, object 1 layer. Okay, so the layer that is directly above it. And so for that reason, it's important that we don't put any layers in between this, because if we do, that's the layer the beauty pass is going to try and use as the track matte. Okay, so what I like to do with this is to select both these layers, the object buffer and the beauty pass, and change the layer label. Okay, or as I like to call it, the layer color. Okay, so I'll click, I've selected both layers. I'm going to click on this kind of light turquoise color and then choose whichever color I want. I'll just go with red. Okay, now both of those layers are red, and to me that just visually means, hey, don't break these up. Okay, now you may be wondering why we don't pre-compose these layers, and that's because it's really unnecessary unless whatever specific effect we're going to use requires it, and we'll see an example of that in the next example. Okay, so now what we're seeing is the Dodge City text from the object buffer, right? It's cutting out the beauty pass and only showing the Dodge City text part of our beauty pass layer. Okay, and then we're seeing the ambient occlusion on top. So now what we want to do is drag another copy of our beauty pass from our project window and place it below the beauty pass and object 1 layers. So it should be at the very bottom of our composition. Okay. Now, I do like to stay organized in After Effects as well. It's bugging me that I didn't create any folders for my project window here. I typically create one for sequences, for comps, and then assets, which can include any still images, sounds, things like that. We can also name our layers down here. So for instance, this beauty pass we just added, that's using the object buffer, we could actually rename this to Dodge City. That way we know what part of the image this is. Okay. This layer here is filling in everything that we don't have an object buffer for. All right, and so in other examples, we'll have multiple object buffers, but we'll always need a layer at the very bottom to fill in anything we don't have that object buffer for. And so what we want to do is rename this one background beauty. So we know it's kind of the background, but it's also our beauty pass. Okay, so that'll fill in everything else. Let's add our last layer in here. We're not going to use it quite yet, but we can still add it to our composition just so it's already there. So what we want to do is add our depth pass to the very bottom and hide it. Just hide its visibility. It doesn't need to be visible for us to use it. Okay? So we've talked about the ambient occlusion pass and how we can increase the or lower the transparency or duplicate this layer if we want more ambient occlusion. We've set up our object buffer, but let's see what we can do with it. Because now that we have it set up, we can apply effects to our Dodge City layer here, and that will change just that part of our image. Okay, so let's add a color correction effect. So I'm going to go up top to my effects menu, choose color correction, and really for changing colors, the one I use the most is hue and saturation. Okay, from here, if all we want to do is shift the hue, we can just twirl this around, and you can see we're able to change the color of this to anything we want. Okay, so that's very, very powerful. Right? Once again, we're able to do all of this without re-rendering inside of Cinema, or from Cinema 4D. Now, we have to be careful with this though, and the reason for that is just because we can change the color of the actual object doesn't mean it's always going to work out well in our scene. And in this example here, if we look really closely, right here, as well as down here, you'll notice we're still seeing the red reflection. Okay, so we're changing the color of the object itself with our object buffer and our hue and saturation layer here, or effect here, but we're not able to change the color of the reflection. So really, we want to be tweaking the colors, making small adjustments, right? So even that, just making it perhaps pushing it a little bit more towards pink or purple, we can probably get away with, okay? And that reflection won't be quite as noticeable, although, is sticking out just a bit to me. So that's why I say we really only want to tweak and make small adjustments to colors, because we might run into issues with reflections or similar things with refractions or transparent objects where we're still able to see the original color somewhere. Okay, but that's how we can change the color of objects or parts of our image using object buffers as well as the hue and saturation effect. Okay, so what else can we do to this? Well, along with compositing and using all of our different multipasses we set up, we can also do things like global color correction, camera-based effects like depth of field and motion blur, vignetting is another camera-based effect. Okay, and so those are the types of things we're going to start to go through now. All right, so what I'm going to do is start by creating a new adjustment layer, and I'm going to name this color correction. Okay, and I usually abbreviate that CC, but I will call this color correction. And on this adjustment layer, the effect I'm going to add is in the color correction menu again, and it's called Lumetri Color. Now this Lumetri Color effect is almost identical to the Lumetri Color effect in Premiere. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I like it, is because maybe you guys are already familiar with it, and if you're not, it would make it easier to go into Premiere and do color correction. The other reason why I really like it is because it's several effects in one. So I don't need separate levels or curves or that type of stuff. A lot of that is already built in here. So you can see we have some basic stuff like exposure, contrast, highlights, all that good stuff. Okay. And generally speaking, I try to think of our, animations like we would pictures. Okay. So the same type of color correction we would do to an image, we can do to, or even a video, we can do to our sequences here. Okay, so I like to go down to creative. That's my favorite place. And to experiment with these different looks. So if you just click on that drop down where it says none, you'll get a bunch of different looks. And these are different kind of presets for color correction. And unfortunately, unlike in Premiere, there isn't like a good way to preview them. So you kind of just have to go through and click on them and see what each of them does. But what these do is, apply some preset color correction. Some are brighter, some are darker. All right, that one actually looks okay. And this can also make our project feel a little bit more film-like or cinematic because we're applying color correction that we might see in different films. Okay, so I'm actually liking the way this Iron HDR one is looking. I can always come back and work with the intensity of it if I want more or less. And then we also have some interesting adjustments here, like faded film, okay, sharpen, vibrance, and saturation. Right? I do like to turn down the saturation a bit because oftentimes the saturation of our images we render out of from 3D just come out a little bit too saturated compared to what we might have in the real world. Okay, you could also do split toning. And since this is an outdoor scene, what I might do with this is set my shadows blue, like they might be if it was a sunny day out, and then my highlights yellow. Okay, and then with the tint balance, you can kind of play with that, going back and forth, whether you want more yellow, all right, like we're seeing here, or more blue. All right, and you can see how it's really changing the way my white looks here. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. I did want to show that to you guys though. As I mentioned, we have curves built in, so maybe we can give this a little S curve. All right, I can keep going down. And I still have more color wheels I could work with in terms of my midtones, highlights, and shadows. You can also, adjust those. So this is very similar to a levels. Okay, and then we also have vignetting down here at the very bottom. And a negative vignette will actually give us that darker vignette we're looking for. Okay, so not only can we do color correction with this, we can do stylization. And so Lumetri Color can help us with that, but there's also some other effects I like to use. So for this type of thing where I'm trying to get maybe like an old film look, something like an old Western might look, I'm going to add the tritone effect. So I'll go to Effect, Color Correction, Tritone. And you can see right away it just gets rid of all my colors and makes my highlights white, my midtones brown, and my shadows dark. And while that's great, I like to kind of blend this a bit with my original. And so somewhere around, 35, 40% looks pretty good to me. Okay, so I'm liking the way that looks. And this is all really just kind of creative stuff here. So, what you think is going to look good, if you're trying to match a particular style of film, time of cinema, depending on what type of equipment was used or whether it's film, we can do all sorts of different things with different effects like this. Okay, so tritone looks pretty good. All right, I am going to create a new adjustment layer for my last kind of stylization effect I want to use, and this is going to be grain. So I'm going to rename this adjustment layer once I've created it and name it grain. Okay. And so now that we've created that adjustment layer, I'll go back to my effect menu, go to noise and grain, and choose add grain. Okay. Now, right now, it's only trying to show us the grain in this little preview window here. That's not going to do me any good. So I want to switch the viewing mode from preview to final output. Okay, now you can see we got a lot more noise and grain happening. I'm going to zoom in just so you guys can see this a bit more in the video. Okay, so that actually looks pretty good to me. And now that we've done that, I can go back and add something I should have added towards the very beginning, and that is a little bit of a background here. Okay, so we're going to do something simple. I'm just going to create a new solid, layer, new solid, and I'll call this sky. And the color doesn't really matter because we're going to add a gradient ramp to this. And one of the reasons why I like to do this very early on is because, we've done all this color correction to it, and so the colors we choose are going to look very different with all these effects applied. But that should be fine. Okay, so I'm going to make sure I have my sky layer selected. I will go to the effect menu, go to generate, there we go, and choose gradient ramp. All right, so there's gradient ramp. And now I can just choose my colors. I can see my white color is going to be closer to the horizon. My darker colors, I'm going to be more up in the sky. So I think for the end color, as they call it, I'm going to make that just kind of a nice yellow. All right, maybe a bit more orange. That's pretty bad. So maybe something like that. Okay. And then for my start color, which is this darker value, the one towards the top here, I'm going to make that just like a nice sky blue. Okay. And, once again, we can see just how much our color correction is doing based on, these colors. And so if I turn it off, you can see just how much more vibrant it is, you know, without that color correction. And so while that's really a bit too much, I think we'll just leave it for right now. Okay. So those are some of the things we can do stylistically when it comes to compositing, as well as with color correction. Let's finish up with our camera-based effects. All right, let's start with depth of field. And so to do depth of field, we're going to need another adjustment layer. So new adjustment layer. And I want to place this one below the color correction. And then we want to rename that adjustment layer depth of field. Okay, so once I've named that depth of field, I want to add my effect to it. So I'll go back to my effects menu. Now we want to go blur and sharpen and choose camera lens blur. Okay, everything's going to blur or go out of focus. Okay, so we'll fix that in a second. The first thing though I want to fix is the fact that I can see this kind of weird transparent border here. And so what I want to do is come into my camera lens blur effect and turn on repeat edge pixels. Okay, that'll fix that. Now what we need to do is tell it to use our depth of field pass, our Z depth pass. And so we need to come to our blur map options and find where it says layer. See where it says none. We want to click on that drop down and choose our depth pass. Okay. Now what we should see is that as objects get further and further away here, they're actually getting more and more in focus. And that's kind of the opposite of what we'd want at this point in our animation. And so all we have to do to play with our depth of field and make changes to it is adjust our blur focal distance. So if I put that up all the way to 255, you can see now we have the opposite happening. We have objects that are closer to the camera are in focus, and they get out of focus as they get further away. Okay, and so this is the property we would animate, all right, to kind of do like a rack focus or to change, what's in focus and what is out of focus. The strength of this effect can be controlled by the blur radius. And if we turn this up too much, things start to break down a bit. So we do want to be a little bit careful. But you can see as I turn this up to 15, this depth of field effect becomes much more pronounced. And so I would probably dial it back to something like 10. Okay, so that looks pretty good. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Okay, So we've added vignette, one camera-based effect, depth of field, a second camera-based effect. The last one we're going to add is motion blur. And motion blur is another camera-based effect that we are used to seeing, in any kind of video, still image, photo. Okay. And so we want to create another adjustment layer. We're going to call that motion blur. And I want to place this layer just above actually up top, below the grain is the most important one. Okay. Now on this motion blur adjustment layer, the effect we want to add is in our effects menu, time, pixel motion blur. Okay, awesome. All right, now you can see it kind of blurred everything, and what it's doing is trying to track the different directions our pixels are moving. And so it may look a little bit strange here, but if I just try and find a place that has our text animated a bit more, maybe it's coming in, maybe. Okay, almost there. Perfect. So you can see how it's trying to blur the text and the direction it's moving. And overall, it does a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but it is a lot faster than if we were rendering motion blur directly out of Cinema 4D. Okay? So it's a lot quicker. And once again, if for whatever reason we don't like the way it looks, we just turn it off and we can go back to our, the way our project looked without it. Okay? So that's really it for this example. Okay? And you may be going, oh, this motion blur looks terrible. Well, it is not nearly as noticeable when we're playing this back at 30 frames per second. Okay, so if you're looking at a still image, it may look too much, may look strange, but when played back at 30 frames per second, generally not a big deal. Okay, so let's go ahead and render this out, get it ready to turn in. So let's go to Composition, add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue, and oh, wow, good for me. It's not installed. Okay, fantastic. So you guys should know how to render out of the Adobe Media Encoder queue. Okay, I'll make sure that's fixed. But render it out, last name, first name, multipass, and as an MP4, get that turned in, and then move on to the next example.